Good morning. My name is Jeremy Hooper, and today I'll be discussing the crash of Eastern Airlines Flight 401 that occurred on December 29, 1972 in the Florida Everglades, just west of Miami, Florida. This case study on automation and workload management and crew resource management more broadly illustrates just one more tragic accident we've studied this term that did not have to happen, but for critical lapses in human performance that we'll examine further during this presentation. Flight 401 was a routine passenger flight from John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York to the Miami International Airport in Florida. The flight was uneventful until the crew attempted to extend the landing gear on approach to Miami. The green light that informs the crew that the nose landing gear was properly extended failed to illuminate. The crew executed a missed approach and informed air traffic control of their need to troubleshoot the indication. They engaged the autopilot to hold altitude at 2,000 feet. And then all three crew members and a jump seating mechanic became preoccupied with the malfunction while no one was monitoring the airplane's flight path or instruments. I'll discuss specific automation issues on a later slide, but ultimately the autopilot reacted as designed, but in a manner inconsistent with the flight crew's expectations. The result was that the airplane impacted terrain in the alligator-infested swamps of the Florida Everglades. While it was determined that the landing gear had extended normally, the initial problem was traced to a burned-out light bulb. The accident killed 101 of 176 people on board. The National Transportation Safety Board determined that the probable cause of the accident was the failure of the flight crew to monitor the flight instruments during the final 4 minutes of flight and to detect an unexpected descent soon enough to prevent impact with the ground. Preoccupation with the malfunctioning of the nose landing gear position indicating system distracted the crew's attention from the instruments and allowed the descent to go unnoticed. From a CRM perspective, the captain failed to properly assign duties during the abnormal situation, which would include clarifying which pilot would be designated the pilot flying and which pilot would assume the role of pilot monitoring. The individual tasked with the pilot flying role should devote their sole focus and attention to maintaining aircraft control and managing the flight path, whether he does this himself or with the assistance of an autopilot. In today's sixth-generation airline CRM training, at least at my airline, this role is normally assigned to the first officer, who may also be assigned the role of communicating with ATC. This gives the other pilot, normally the captain, the ability to expand his focus and address the abnormal situation, run any applicable checklists, and coordinate as necessary with other crew members, flight attendants, company dispatch, and maintenance control. Both pilots are now highly trained on verbalizing, verifying, and monitoring interaction with automated systems. In the case of Eastern 401, the first officer had been the pilot flying for the leg and would presumably have retained that role during the accident sequence. However, the landing gear indicator lights sit in front of the first officer, and the captain was tasking him with troubleshooting tasks unrelated to flying the airplane. The first officer even queried the captain as to whether he should be the one flying the airplane. However, the preoccupied captain did not give a clear direction. He told the first officer to turn on the autopilot, and perhaps the crew felt like this relieved them of the responsibility to monitor what the autopilot was doing. At any rate, in any abnormal situation, the captain must be the orchestrator and clearly delineate tasks among his crew members to maximize the crew's effectiveness and situational awareness. This responsibility falls squarely upon the captain, and in this, he failed. The L-1011 was brand new to the Eastern Fleet, in service for only about 4 months. While it possessed primitive technology by today's standards, in 1972 it was a state-of-the-art modern Lockheed product that was innovative and ahead of its time in many ways. Thus, while the three crew members may have been highly experienced pilots, their experience in the L-1011 was quite limited. They had previously flown earlier generation aircraft with very little automation, but by the time they began flying the TriStar, it's possible they had already begun to suffer one of the drawbacks of highly capable automation. That is, complacency and disengagement, overconfidence in the capabilities of the advanced avionics. In this accident, like I mentioned earlier, the autopilot was engaged and commanded to hold an altitude of 2,000 feet. However, it was determined that the captain likely unintentionally bumped the control yoke while turning around to talk to the flight engineer, exerting a force that disengaged the command and altitude hold modes of the autopilot and caused the pitch axis to revert to a basic mode known as control wheel steering. The lateral axis remained in command and slave to the selected heading, and therefore the autopilot paddle switch also remained in command and likely led the pilot's belief that all axes of the autopilot were being commanded by the autopilot, which was not the case. A display like the one in the photo probably would have shown the crew that the altitude hold mode had been disengaged if proper monitoring had been taking place. The aircraft began to descend from a relatively low altitude of 2,000 feet in response to the control yoke input. An audible tone was heard on the cockpit voice recorder that should have alerted the crew to a 250-foot altitude deviation. But under preoccupation with the landing gear malfunction, there is no evidence that the crew noticed this aural tone or responded to it in any way. The NTSB report revealed that Eastern Airlines had decided to inhibit a flashing amber light below 2,500 feet. This flashing light would also have alerted the crew to the altitude deviation, possibly giving them one more chance to notice that their altitude had deviated from what was previously commanded. Furthermore, Eastern Airlines pilots had been instructed to never use the control wheel steering mode of the autopilot and were thus not trained on its use or limitations. I want to briefly address the role of air traffic control in the Eastern 401 accident. The radar controller on duty in Miami had been somewhat task saturated while working another flight that was experiencing a malfunction of its own. It should be noted that Miami was equipped with a newly installed radar system that tracked an airplane's altitude on his radar screen. This display showed the controller that the L-1011 was an altitude of 900 feet, well below the altitude the aircraft was supposed to be flying. However, it was not uncommon for erroneous indications to be displayed, so the controller was not overly concerned. Nevertheless, he made a vague inquiry to the flight along the lines of, "How are things going out there?" rather than a more concise inquiry such as, "Say altitude," that might have clued the crew into what was happening. The controller was not faulted in any way on the basis that it was not in his job description to issue such alerts to flight crews. This seems to be in line with other accidents we've studied, where ATC clearly had one or more opportunities to intervene and break the accident chain, but they did not do so. Present-day thought processes on CRM instruct us that all participants in the aviation system, including ATC, are stakeholders when it comes to safety and must voice their concerns in an unambiguous way to prevent future mishaps. Today we looked at the crash of Eastern Airlines Flight 401 and how this accident illustrates the fundamental changes needed to address human factors and crew resource management in commercial aviation. While perhaps not appreciated at the time as a valuable case study, this tragedy helped establish a framework for later CRM training on how captains can become more effective leaders and flight crews may better interact as cohesive teams. Modern concepts employed in newer glass cockpits such as verbalize, verify, and monitor trace directly back to lessons learned from mishaps such as Eastern 401. This concludes my presentation. I'll be happy to take any questions or feedback. Enjoy the rest of your Thanksgiving weekend.